Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Salt and Health Outcomes session. And I'm the chair for this session. My name is Ismail Sattar, and I'm the CEO of HubSalt. HubSalt is a company based out of Pakistan, and we manufacture solar salt, both sea salt, lake salt, and we manufacture a lot of pink Himalayan rock salt. So I've been meeting with a lot of people, and people are asking me the same question, that why do we call it Himalayan pink salt? So there is a very interesting story behind this name, which I would like to disclose today. It was in 1984 when we started exporting pink Himalayan salt, and at that time we used to call it pink crystal salt, and the first consuming country from us was Germany. So our partner in Germany one day called me and told me that we want to keep some name because it's getting popular slowly, and we need to have some identification for this product. And he wanted to name this salt as Sophia. And why Sophia? Because Sophia was his girlfriend's name. And with the 2 years of knowing him, Sophia was the second girlfriend. So I could imagine that how many girlfriends he would be changing. So I told him that it would not look nice to keep a woman's name for rock salt. So let me do some research. And I went home and I checked the encyclopedia, because in those days, Dr. Google was not there. And the closest mountain range I could find from the salt range was Himalayas. So I requested him that you should keep your name as Himalayan pink salt. So that's how the name pink Himalayan salt came into being, and today it's a very common name and everybody knows this product by the name of pink Himalayan salt. And I'm very happy about it that I kept this name way back in 1986. So I will not take a lot of time because this is the last session and we can see the fatigue on everybody's face since it's the first day. So I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Elderman. He is based at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and he'll be speaking on dietary sodium and health, what is known and not known. So it sounds a very interesting topic. So Dr. Elderman, please.
Thanks. I hope I remember how to use this thing. I very much appreciate the opportunity to meet and talk with you all today, and I'm grateful for that. But I think I've been given a very dangerous spot. It's between you and dinner, which is not the place to be. Anyway, what I'd like to do is to talk for a while on this topic, but I suspect that I'm not accustomed to talking to more general audiences, and so I suspect I won't be as clear as I might be. But what I think would be a good idea is if we save some time at the end for questions and answers. I hope the answers will be there. One more thing, could I get some water? It's a very dry country here. Thanks. Nice to see you. I think I'll have a sip. Well, it is interesting that we know a great deal about salt. I'd say we know about 90% of what we need to know about dietary salt intake and health. And there's about 10% that we don't know, and that's the most important 10%. Well, in the United States, I think it started in, I think this was 1977. One of our most distinguished public health authorities, in testimony with a congressional committee interested in nutrition, it was primarily focused on fats, but anyway, at the end he was asked about salt, and he said, you know, as sort of mincing words here, I think, that maybe there's something to do with salt and blood pressure is bad for heart disease. And that initiated an extraordinary set of occurrences. Well, the issue really now has been that national guidelines in the United States, Western Europe, and lots of other places, I think, has established the notion that no one should eat more than 2.3 grams of sodium a day. That would mean that about 90% of the people in the world would have to reduce their sodium intake. It's a tall order. Well, as I say, a great deal is known. First of all, sodium is an essential nutrient. By that I mean life is incompatible with the absence of salt. And that means, of course, that at some point close to that absence of salt, things go south. And there is probably harm somewhere, we don't know where that is, at the low end of sodium intake. Most Americans, and actually most people all over the world, eat between 2.5 and 5 grams of sodium a day. That's about 85 or 90% of the world's population. We also know that sodium intake has been remarkably resistant to change. Sodium intake influences a variety of physiologic factors, including blood pressure and others. Variation in sodium intake is associated with cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Associated with. I'm not saying it's causal, but it's associated with. Well, first let's go through those and give some examples of the data and the information that's available in regard to sodium intake. And this is a study of 109, it's a compilation of 190 studies, I think in about 90 countries. Or no, it's, yeah, 190 studies. And what they found was that sodium intake is about between 2.5 and 5 grams of sodium a day. The mean sodium intake around the world is about 3.6 grams a day. Well, where does that data come from? This is part of it. This is from the United States, where fortunately we have more than a half century of information from population surveys about what sodium intake is. And it turns out it's about 3.6 grams per day over that 60-year period. It's pretty impressive consistency of a very small range of sodium intake that the population consumes. Obviously, it doesn't change much. It doesn't change across countries, across cultures, across dietary patterns, and it doesn't in the United States change in regard to the ability to get people to reduce their sodium intake to below 2.3 grams per day. As you can see, over the period from 2004 to 2012, national surveys showed that about 3.5% of the population consumes that amount of consumes the recommended amount of sodium intake. In other words, for the United States, less than 2.3 grams per day. Pretty remarkable that we could only get 3.5% of the population to do that, despite an enormous amount of enthusiasm and energy by those who believe it's a good idea. Well, a lot of people recognize the fact that you can't, by exhortation, get people to change their sodium intake. It makes kind of good sense, I think, because we don't know how much sodium we eat, most of us, and we vary our diet constantly, and so it's interesting that it remains constant in population studies. That's different than individuals. Individuals vary from day to day, but if you've got enough of them, you get the average, and it's a random distribution, and so you end up with a consistent group average. We have no idea what an individual eats in the way of sodium. But at any rate, this is in Great Britain, where they recognized you couldn't convince people to change their sodium intake, and this is a series of national surveys about sodium intake. This line here, these lines here, depict the pattern of intake over these. I can't see the first year here, but I think the last is 2014, and the first should be about 2006. It was in 2008, I believe, that they introduced a policy of having industry alter or reduce the sodium in content of their products. And as you can see, changing the composition of the diet by law didn't make any difference. It's an incredible consistency of groups, not of individuals, but of groups. Well, in any event, the effect of the UK mandated reduction of the content of sodium in processed food subs did not make any difference at all in sodium intake. So you can't do it by exhortation, and you can't do it by fiat. The tenacity of this sodium intake for groups is really, I think, sort of a remarkable thing, since we don't have any idea of how much sodium we are eating as individuals. How come it is that we end up in this place for 50 or 60 years? I think there are only two possibilities. One is divine intervention, which I think is unlikely, and the other possibility is physiology. There are perhaps reasons in people and other animals that drive them to consume sodium because it's essential to life. Well, in addition to this business of the consistency of sodium intake, variations in sodium intake impact a variety of physiological characteristics. Among them, for example, is plasmarenin. Plasmarenin is secreted by the kidneys in response to a variety of stimuli, and it's an important controller of blood pressure, but it is an important predictor of cardiovascular events. So, for example, I did it. For example, that's it. If you're in the range that all Americans and all people all over the world live, your plasmarenin level is going to be about 2. If you reduce it to the recommended level, recommended by virtually all national guidelines, then you almost double your plasmarenin activity. Well, why that matters is because plasmarenin is associated with increased cardiovascular disease mortality. This slide is based on, this is based on a population study of hypertensive people. The Framingham system, the Framingham experience has been translated into a guide to what your risk for cardiovascular disease is. And so there's low and medium and high risk people according to the Framingham characteristics. And as you can see, for the most part, they're certainly in the highest range of sodium intake. There's a tremendous impact on the likelihood of cardiovascular disease. If you go from the first to the third tertile, third of the population, it's almost double. So although sodium intake affects blood pressure, it affects other things that adversely affect cardiovascular outcomes. So you can't use just blood pressure effect to determine the cardiovascular and other health effects. Well, next is the part of this story is the blood pressure story. It's kind of interesting. I mean, remember what Stamler said in 1977, that somehow it's related to blood pressure, but we don't know exactly why and what it means. Well, what this study shows is the randomized trials testing whether reduction of sodium intake lowers blood pressure. And what's clear is this is systolic pressure and this is diastolic pressure. What this shows is that if people have high blood pressure, measured here in systolic and here in diastolic, if they have high blood pressure, lowering sodium has a substantial impact. On the other hand, if you have normal blood pressure, it has no effect on blood pressure. About 70 or 75% of the populations have normal blood pressure. So a universal effort to solve a problem by lowering sodium in terms of its effect on blood pressure might be a useful thing for a minority of the population. And that association of blood pressure effect of lower sodium, I think you might have already seen this slide today, or perhaps. Anyway, as you can see, people with low sodium intake have no effect on their blood pressure. It's only people who have very high levels of sodium in which there's a measurable, meaningful effect on blood pressure. So, plasminogen, bad effect of lowering sodium. Complicated effect of lowering sodium in regard to blood pressure. Well, in sum, there are 2, 4, 6, 8 physiological consequences of lowering sodium. All but one of them is associated with, lowering sodium is associated with increasing all of these other physiological characteristics in terms of its effect on cardiovascular outcomes. So clearly it would be ridiculous to assume that a blood pressure effect would produce the health effect. It's the sum total of all of these consequences, and probably others that we don't know anything about, that will determine the outcome. Well, in addition to the physiological information that we know, and know it for sure from good studies, all of this is based on data that's sufficiently convincing that no one would argue with all of what I've said. Observational studies are interesting. That's what happens in nature. We look at groups of people and try to associate factors that are apparent in these individuals with ultimate outcomes. There have been now more than 36 of these studies. They involve more than 400,000 people. They've been done all over the world. And I think the fascinating thing is that regardless of where you study it, number one, sodium intake, average sodium intake, here it's described as millimoles, but it's the 3.6 grams with a range between somewhere around 2.8 and 5 that's found in all of these studies. Because sodium is required to sustain human health, one would expect that there'd be a U-shaped relationship between sodium intake and cardiovascular events. That's what you see with calcium, with potassium, with vitamin D, all things that are essential. That means there's got to be some harm at the bottom, and there's always the possibility of toxicity at the high end. So what we would expect, I think, from our experience with other similar nutritional elements is that we'll see a J-shaped or U-shaped relationship to the outcome. So we've got a lot of data there. But the problem here is not the magnitude of the data. The data on observational studies is convincing. I don't think anyone but the zealots, of whom none are in this audience, would argue with the notion that there is this J and U-shaped curve. But the problem for us is not the association of sodium intake, but is it causal? Association tells us what happens to free-living people in a normal, regular environment. And it looks like folks who eat too little get into trouble, and folks who eat too much might get in trouble as well. But that doesn't mean that if we changed it, it would do any good. So here's the end of, well, let me show you the data. The first observational study was done in a group of hypertensives, about 3,000 of them. Interesting thing about these people is they were participants in a standardized treatment program. We were studying treatment of high blood pressure. This started in 1974, even before Stamler. And the people who were in charge of this study believed that a low-sodium diet would, A, be good for your blood pressure, and B, would improve cardiovascular outcomes. And so what was central to this program was dietary modification in regard to sodium. Incredibly successful. This was a worksite-based program that the therapists came to the workers at Bloomingdale's and Gimbel's department store and other work environments. And so we never lost patients. We never, we had good records on everybody. So it was a unique opportunity to look at long-term outcomes. And these are on the basis of, I guess, about 8 years of treatment and our observation of those people. And what's fascinating about it is that the sodium intake, here, I did it. The sodium intake of the lowest tertile had the greatest cardiovascular disease occurrence, and those at the highest level here had the lowest. Well, I was involved in this, and what we thought was that there was a linear relationship between sodium intake and cardiovascular outcomes. But then when we looked at the level of sodium intake in these patients who had really been brainwashed, and we had a serious effort made. This group had a sodium intake of about 1 gram, and these had a sodium intake of about 4 grams. So we were comparing, we didn't know that, we didn't recognize it at the time, but we were comparing low sodium to moderate or mid-range sodium. Other studies followed this involving populations that had a wide range of sodium intakes. And this is just 3 examples of these observational studies, which show, I think, fairly consistently, and there are now about 11 studies like this that in different populations that show this same J-shaped or U-shaped relationship to outcome. I'm not sure you can see these numbers here, but this is what we did was what's called a meta-analysis. We collected the studies that were available. There were, I think, at the time of this analysis, I believe that there were 23 or 4 such studies involving about 270,000 people from all over the world. The sodium intake, usual sodium intake here was between 2,500 and 4,000 milligrams of sodium. In other words, between 2.5 and 4 or slightly more than that. And that was about 90% of the population. The low intake group, which is about between 5 and 10% of the population, had a cardiovascular outcome 18% higher than these folks did, and it was highly statistically significant. By the same token, there's a 16% increased risk of cardiovascular disease at the high end. Meta-analysis is not a very highly regarded science. I've heard somebody say that it's like bouillabaisse. If you've got one rotten fish, the whole thing stinks. We don't think that's true, of course, but anyway, that's what we have. But I think in a way, most importantly, if we looked at the people within the usual sodium intake, between 2.5 and 5 grams, and we looked at the low versus the high end within that population of normal people, what we found was that there was absolutely no difference in cardiovascular outcomes. I can't read this now. I know it's right on target. You can see that from this dot here, which is a compilation of all these studies. I think there were 120,000 participants, 25 studies it was. That's a pretty impressive, I think, demonstration that those people in the middle range are by our observation, having the optimal sodium intake. Well, what would that mean if we introduced universal sodium restriction? That's what, I mean, this is a cartoon, obviously, but this is a description of what would happen. There's a risk of excess sodium intake, and that there's a risk at the low end as well. If we have universal sodium restriction, some of these people are going to be moved into the middle. That's great. But some of these people are going to be moved into the high-risk group. So there'll be winners and losers. But most people will not be affected because all these folks in the middle here, the 90% or so, it doesn't matter whether you're at the high end of that or the low. I mean, God would not have made a system that said you all should eat within some narrow range. That would have been silly. And so there's, in all of these essential nutrients, there's a fairly wide range within which the whole population, within which most of the population exists. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. And we're the survivors. Presumably, evolution has had something to do with that. Folks who were able to get the right amount of sodium survived, and folks who couldn't, didn't. Well, the evidence that altering sodium effect, the effect of sodium on health outcomes requires randomized clinical trials. That's in which you compare a population that you've randomly allocated to one level of sodium intake and another level of sodium intake and see if there's a difference in the outcome. And these are rigorous and demanding studies, very difficult in the realm of sodium to be able to mount such studies. There's one, a very well-designed and implemented study that was financed by the National Institutes of Health called TOPE. And that was about a 5-year study. The purpose of that study was not to determine cardiovascular or all-cause mortality. The point of that study was to see what the effect on blood pressure was, and not surprisingly, it was marginal in those 5 years. After that, there was no difference in mortality between those two groups in the 5 years of study. These were 50 to 60-year-old people primarily. There weren't enough deaths in the period to be able to describe the effect on mortality. So the investigators went back to look at outcome data for these two groups 20 years later. So they were no longer in the study. We don't know what their sodium intake was, but the hypothesis of those who did the study was that this is a great thing and they'd probably stay on their low sodium diet and they'd probably demonstrate a difference in cardiovascular outcomes. There's no difference at all. The confidence interval is 66 below to 10% increased. And that's the only data. Now that I think is poor data. I wouldn't want to conclude anything about any actionable item on the basis of that study. But that's all we have. So what conclusions can we make? Number one is that the intake of sodium around the world is pretty much the same, and most people are eating within a reasonably narrow range, 2.5 to 5 grams a day. It's unlikely that anything we can do will affect the sodium intake. I mean, if you can't do it by law, you can't do it by exhortation, what else is there? I guess money, I don't know. But anyway, 15% of intakes that may be deficient, and or 15% between the deficient and the excess look like they may be at risk. And I think that's a question that needs answering, and the only way we can answer that question is whether you remediate the sodium, whether you bring the low up and the high down. So what are the implications for our action? There's no scientific justification for universal sodium intake. Observational studies do predict, I think accurately, what happens in nature, but we don't know whether that's caused by the difference in sodium. It may be other factors that are associated with the sodium. It may not be the sodium at all, or it may be, but we just don't know. And you can't conclude it from the observational studies. And I think the future in this field is to do randomized clinical trials, which I believe are feasible in these narrow groups. That's a small population, and they, I think, are probably different in important ways, and I think we can probably find those people in sufficient numbers in large populations to do these studies. Well, anyway, I'd be delighted to answer any questions that anyone might have.
What about weight?
Weight.
Was weight considered in it?
Yes. In almost all, that's a good question. In almost all of these studies, all of the ancillary factors that might impact on outcome have been controlled for. In other words, they've been examined and their impact on the outcome has been determined. So all of these studies are rigorous. All the ones that were included here were rigorously done, and there's no question that it is the sodium effect and not the weight effect or not the blood pressure effect or not the anything else you can think of. I mean, that we could, consider.
Can we take the questions later because the time has already exceeded and we have 2 more presentations. Can we keep it for the end? So we'll take all the questions today.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alderman. And the next presentation is by Sauraya Chunmuang, and she is from Mokpo National University Solar Salt Research Center in South Korea. Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am very excited to be here today. Thanks the South Institute and all organizations which make this good opportunity happen. So I believe that everybody here already know well about salt debate and the effect of too high or too low salt on human health. So it is good if we have another choice or if we have a good salt which do not harm our body. Oh, no. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I will invite you to see another point of view. There are many types of salt in the world that classified by the production method or its source, but almost all of type of salt it pass through the purification process. So it contains more than 99% of sodium chloride because another minor mineral are removed as an impurity. So I will call this as a mineral deficient salt, and almost knowledge and the research about salt is like meaning of this kind of salt. But the other hand, we have a solar sea salt which are naturally evaporated by the wind and sunlight. This kind of salt contains about 94 to 96% of sodium chloride content, and another is the minor mineral such as magnesium, calcium, and potassium. So when people talking about salt, they never mention which kind of salt they are talking about. So it's just like it's same, but it's really same. So let's see what. Okay, what we are found in our research, we fed the high salt diet, it 8% of salt without calculating sodium chloride content on the salt-sensitive rat. So you're gonna see that mineral-rich salt gives significantly lower both systolic and diastolic blood pressure than mineral-deficient salt. But however, in this experiment, because the mineral-rich salt have lower sodium chloride content, so it may think that the lower of blood pressure is come from the lower of sodium chloride intake. So we perform the experiment again, which calculate the same amount of sodium chloride with 3% of sodium chloride from each salt, and the results still similar to the previous experiment, that mineral-rich salt give lower blood pressure level than mineral-deficient salt. And not only in salt-sensitive rats, we perform it in the Sprout-Delaire rat, which representative of normal rat. Is the result still same, that mineral-rich salt give lower blood pressure than mineral-deficient salt. And we also determine the protein expression of blood pressure-related protein. And VEGF is kind of protein that involved in vascular extension. So increase of this protein means lower blood pressure, and the row A is just opposite way. And the results show we found that mineral-rich salt give higher VEGF and lower row A expression level compared to mineral-deficient salt. So now we're quite sure that different salts give different effect on blood pressure. But we have many types of salt in the world. So how about another salt? In Korea, they roast the mineral-rich salt with the bamboo trunk at more than 800 degrees Celsius. It's called bamboo salt. So our experiment is compare the effect of bamboo salt on blood pressure compared to its original mineral-rich salt. So in this experiment, we use implantable telemetry. With this method, the rat will not get any stress during the blood pressure determination. So the result quite accurate and stable. So as you see, the result show that, in the beginning of experiment period, at first 2 weeks, the blood pressure of the bamboo salt group is not increased, it's quite stable. But anyway, it's high salt intake. After 2 weeks, it's increased. And the difference, the significant difference were observed only after 4 days of the high salt intake. And also, we also determine, again, VEGF and RhoA protein, and we found that bamboo salt give higher VEGF and lower RhoA protein expression level than mineral-rich salt in both kidney and skeletal muscle. So now we're quite sure that we have various kinds of salt is made, and it affects blood pressure differently. And when we're talking about blood pressure, there are 3 pathways that relate to blood pressure. First, oxidative stress, and renin-angiotensin system, and the endothelial cell function. So we're gonna check one by one. We found that the bamboo salts give lower lipid oxidation and protein oxidation than another salt group, and the mineral-rich group give lower protein oxidation than mineral-deficient group. This is mean that mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt give lower oxidative stress than the mineral-deficient salt. And next, we determine ACE activity and angiotensin II expression. ACE is the main component in renin-angiotensin system. Higher of its activity means it produces more angiotensin II production, and angiotensin II is an active vasoconstrictor. So higher of its activity and the angiotensin II expression is mean higher blood pressure. And we found that mineral deficient salt give highest ACE activity than another salt group, and the mineral-rich group and bamboo salt group is just similar to control. Also, immunohistology studies show that mineral-rich group and the bamboo salt group give lower expression level of angiotensin II compared to the mineral-deficient group. And we determine the relaxation response to acetylcholine and sodium nitrophosphide. The principle is acetylcholine is endothelium dependent vasodilator, and the sodium nitrophosphide is endothelium independent. So this is mean that if it responds to acetylcholine differently, that means something happened with endothelial cell function. So we found that mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt group improve blood vessel relaxation, respond to endothelial cell function significantly. And it's not different in response to sodium nitrophosphide. So that means if nothing happened with the vascular smooth muscle cell. So we also determine the eNOS and its phosphorylation protein expression. eNOS is endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So increasing of this enzyme, it will increase nitric oxide production, and nitric oxide is the vasodilator. So that means the blood pressure will decrease. And the active of eNOS is simply by phosphorylation of its active site. So increase of these two proteins is mean lower of blood pressure. So the results show that mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt give higher eNOS expression level, and it's also in its phosphorylation protein expression. So also we determine the arginase 1 protein. We can explain that if we have L-arginine as a substrate, if it met with eNOS, it will produce nitric oxide, so the blood pressure will decrease. But if the L-arginine met with this enzyme arginase 1, it will produce another, so it reduces nitric oxide production. So that means the blood pressure will increase. So the results show that bamboo salt gives significantly lower arginase 1 protein expression than another salt. And if we see in nitric oxide production, we found that mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt give higher nitric oxide production than mineral-deficient group. So in summary, you can see the figure that the red arrow did indicate my result that mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt compared to mineral-deficient salt. So in totally, mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt decrease oxidative stress and its effect on the angiotensin production, and overall result is related to endothelial function. So the conclusion is mineral-rich salt and bamboo salt give less blood pressure level by improving endothelial cell function. So, ladies and gentlemen, I very exciting to be here, and only one reason I want to be here is just to share this information to you who are the key person on this field. So if you think that this information is useful, let's share this to your family, your friends, or your colleagues and people around you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sauraya, for your wonderful presentation. And now I would like to invite Ms. Janice Johnson from Cargill Salt.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience for hanging out at the last lecture of the day. I appreciate that. You're probably wondering why. Actually, I should tell you, I'm a food scientist. So you're probably wondering why. Well, why would a food scientist be so interested in health outcome of, sodium intake and, again, health outcomes? Well, as a food scientist, I work a lot with customers, in the food industry trying to achieve sodium reduction. It's become a big initiative to them. And so we really do try and look at these health studies and understanding them very well, because it's the importance of the numbers, the data that's coming out, that can really set policies and set regulations. And so as the food industry, we take those to heart. We want to be compliant if there's any policies, similarly regulatory policies that may come into play. So it's very important for us to understand what's happening, but also making sure the numbers are correct, because big decisions can be made on that. And talking about, let's see if I get this right. There we go. And looking at the numbers, they're pretty clear. You look at the World Health Organizations and some of the research and data that they've collected, 41 million people die every year due to non-communicable diseases. Of that, 17.9 is due to cardiovascular disease, which is 44% of that original number there. And we know 1 billion people are affected globally by high blood pressure or hypertension. And they believe 2.5 million of it is preventable if the individual consumes approximately 2,000 milligrams per day. So it's these numbers that become very important for us. Again, key decisions are being made on this. The better we understand the numbers, the more accurate the numbers are, the better we're going to do for the overall health of the public. So let's take a look at the numbers here. You know, you saw some data before earlier today pointing out about sodium and the importance of sodium and how much sodium is correct for consumption. We know sodium is an essential nutrient. You've heard that many times today. It definitely regulates blood volume, but it also has a lot of other functions in the physiological body as well. And consuming high levels, they believe greater than 2 grams a day of sodium, can really increase that blood pressure. And similarly, when we talked a little bit earlier about this, you heard it from others before, there is a role that potassium plays in this as well. And as human beings, we all underconsume potassium. It's pretty normal, and we're underestimating the importance of what that nutrient plays in the overall blood pressure story as well. So just if you look at it from on a global perspective, you know, some of these were these very large epidemiological studies trying to understand what is the consumption of sodium and potassium. And we see again, as you've seen before, the medium range is generally around like that 4,000 milligrams a day. So ranges, depends upon what part of the country that you're living or what part of the planet that you're living in. But then the interesting one again is like there's some data out there on potassium as well. And as you see, it confirms what everybody believes and knows, that we definitely underconsume potassium. Again, the importance of these numbers and understanding these numbers are really to help direct and guide us to understand what is the right number that we should be consuming. Where do these numbers come from? How do people decide policies or regulations? It's really based upon a lot of these studies, either clinical studies, which it can be known as intervention studies, really trying to look at that cause and effect, or else it can be the epidemiological studies, the observational studies, looking at a large pool of population. The randomized clinical trials, they're set under very controlled conditions. You select a group of people that may have what you're interested in. They may have hypertension, pre-hypertensive state. They can have different ethnicities, different sexes, but it's very, very controlled. And they do very controlled diets. I'm going to randomize them. I'm going to take this set of the population, my group, and I'm going to put them through a wash phase where they're going to eat either low sodium diet or high sodium diet to normalize them, and then feed them different sodium levels. Well, what they've seen in a lot of these studies and what you've seen and heard earlier today, a lot of these have found a linear dose response between sodium intake and blood pressure. So the lower the sodium that you consume, the lower your blood pressure would be. Very consistent. I think from scientist to scientist, so McGregor, Johnson, they all have seen the same. The DASH diet is pretty interesting because, you're looking at 2 different diets. You're looking at a diet that has similar sodium content between a controlled diet, which is kind of like the average, what the average Americans were consuming, compared to a diet that had high vegetables, high fruit, low red meat, they wanted low fat. So things, again, in the composition of the food that could also be beneficial to you. When I think of fruits and vegetables, I think of high source of potassiums. So these things come into play. There's no doubt that there are benefits that you'll see from that. What they're finding is very consistent with what everybody else has seen, that the lower the sodium, the less blood pressure effect that you see. More beneficial for those with hypertension versus those that are normotensive. You'll see differences in the results there, but very consistent. These diets or these randomized clinical trials are really taken to heart when you see committees coming together to form what are the recommended sodium intake, what's the recommended potassium intake, recommended any nutrient intake. They use these types of trials because of the high appearance of credence that comes with them, because they are controlled diets. And these are really largely the pool of studies that are used in order to really try and make guidance and good key decisions on what things should be, such as, again, sodium intake recommended levels. However, what we've seen in recent that have been coming out more and more are a lot of these epidemiological studies. Again, the importance of these is they're looking at a large pool of populations. There are no randomized control studies being done. It's just basically what they're doing on a daily basis. They may have other disease states such as diabetes. They could have hypertension. They could be normotensive. Just really lacking of exercise, more exercise, et cetera. All these things are kind of taken into place. And then they actually kind of look at measurements of, sodium excretion, potassium excretion, as well as other biomarkers. So starting to look at some of the things that we heard a lot about earlier. What about the renin activity that's happening in the plasma? What about some of these hormones, stress hormones, hormones that kind of kick in that renal activity? Really, and then trying to understand correlations. So you can do some very sophisticated either statistics or analysis to really try and understand what things are impacting what, so that you can try and draw correlations. These tend to not have as great a strength as what you see in the randomized controlled trial, but they're really two different types of studies, each bringing valuable information to the table. There's no doubt that when it comes to looking at cardiovascular incidences and mortality, easier to do an epidemiological trial than it is to do in a randomized controlled trial, because they take a long time to do before you can start seeing that. You've seen some, like 5 years, which was just mentioned earlier there. That's really not long enough to see some of those effects. So really, it may be that you need to take all information and really wholeheartedly look at it to really try and understand the full picture of the story of what's happening. But again, what happens is that these studies come out periodically. Various governments or organizations undergo a review as to the importance and the value that new studies come and bring out, and does that change the dialogue? Does that change the opinion of what we think about with sodium intake as well as health outcomes? More interesting, I think, in a lot of these epidemiological studies is the fact that they're going after cardiovascular incidences and mortality. It really does answer a totally different question than what some of these randomized control trials were, because they were going after blood pressure. And then you have to believe in the hypothesis that sodium intake increases hypertension, which therefore increases cardiovascular disease. Therefore, sodium intake causes cardiovascular disease. You have to believe in that transitive property there. These randomized, or these epidemiological studies, they're just looking at it totally different from a different angle, really trying to find correlations. And they can actually look at, again, cardiovascular disease on a different level and really get some really rich information out of there. And because of this, again, has really stirred the debate within the organization or within the community, and it's, again, is very important information that we should really use wisely, because a lot of decisions are being made either on a policy or regulatory level that impacts a lot of the food industry for sure. As I mentioned, periodically data comes out, so various organizations get together and they start reviewing them. So what we've seen here in the US as an example is that we had the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Sciences, get together to review a lot of the data that had occurred between a certain period of time, because a lot of time had passed since the last review had come. And then really what they concluded, again, is what they saw is that there was a positive relationship between increase of sodium intake greater than 2.3 grams a day and the risk of cardiovascular disease. And then the evidence, interestingly though, is the evidence was inconsistent between lowering sodium intake to 1.5 grams a day. So not enough good data out there to really make a judgment call one way or the other. And that was a good outcome on that. At least that was really taking kind of the science today, looking at the credibility of the science, the quality of the science, and really coming up with the conclusion that there just wasn't enough of it there to support it one way or the other. Recently, the Agency for Health Care Research Quality, otherwise known as the AHRQ report, pulled some data again together to really start looking and reviewing what has come out new, what has changed in the scientific community that would cause us maybe to think a little bit differently about this story of salt intake and its effect on health outcomes. What they concluded was that it's still beneficial to reduce sodium and increase potassium. And they are no longer saying that it just has to be fruits and vegetables. They're saying potassium from sources that are like or salt alternatives. So at least they recognize again that it's not solely a sodium story, that there's other factors that really do kind of come into play. And then lastly, what we're undergoing here in the US is we're going to be doing dietary review or reference intake, a review of the dietary reference take of sodium and potassium. And that is coming underway here very soon. They're actually going to be using that ARC report as part of the basis of their research and finding. So it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of that. We don't anticipate that happening very soon, or the results coming out very soon. That committee has just been identified and will be beginning their initiative here shortly. So again, from a food industry perspective, the way we view that is that this really has a big impact on what we do in how we produce foods and what we put out into the food supply. And as many of you may know, the WHO organization, World Health Organization, really took an initiative a few years back to really try and figure out how that they can reduce the the non-communicable diseases, and happens to be cardiovascular disease happens to be one of them. Out of that, sodium has also been identified. And so they asked their member unions to join in really try and help reduce sodium by 30% in the food supply chain. And that's a pretty big undertaking if you had to understand it from a food manufacturing perspective. Salt does a lot of very interesting things. There has been a systematic review of what has happened in a lot of these different geographies on sodium initiatives. How many countries are participating in there? How are they doing it? And what are some of the programs that they're doing? And in 2015, about 75 countries had committed to a sodium reduction initiative in itself. And there are various strategies across the board, some that are very, very strong, such as really working with food manufacturers to say, hey, we really would like you to reduce your sodium content in your food. It can be through a voluntary program, or a few of them have mandated it. So if you look at South Africa, they're probably one of the more stronger on the mandate level. They've gone through several food categories, whereas a lot of other countries that have mandated it really have done maybe 3 to 4. But the one common one that is seen in all the mandates is bread. Bread is the one food that we consume the most a day, so the frequency of consumption has really led that to be one of the greater sources of sodium in the food supply chain. Other strategies include consumer education. That actually tends to be one of the stronger ones that we look at. If you look at all those different geographies involved in sodium initiatives, they all have a consumer education point of it. And then there's also front of package labeling, something again kind of on the educational path to help consumers as to, this is a product that may not be of the best nutritional quality for you. So they'll do things like they did in UK, where they put the red, yellow, and green light on the front of the food package, and if it's red, that means that it's not very good for you, like stop, you might want to reconsider this. And then the green being that, yeah, this one meets the guidelines of what we say the nutritional profile of this food product should be. In the state or the city of New York, they have gone so far as to create a label that is a little bit of a triangle with a salt icon that they're using in restaurants, because restaurants aren't as good as when you look at processed foods, where if you pick up a can of soup, you flip to the back, you have a nutrition fact panel. Restaurants, you don't have that luxury of being able to read that. So what the New York City's decided to do is for restaurants that have greater than 20 chains or 20 establishments, they're required to put this label on their menu to designate that this meal has a very high sodium content, greater than 2,300. You might want to consider making another choice. So we understand that that's a pretty important tool that can be used to help them convey their message, help that educational piece of it. There's also a lot of intervention types initiatives where they'll actually be working with public settings. So I always think of a school. Here again in the United States, we have requirements on what sodium targets can be in certain food categories. A lot of your federal dollars are dependent upon it. So if you're a school system that is taking money from the government, you have to meet this requirement, or you could potentially stand the chance of losing your federal funding, which can be pretty devastating for a lot of schools, for sure. And then really when these strategies, what these geographies think about is really where is the source of sodium come from? We certainly know that in more of the Asian countries, it tends to be more of the home cooking. That's where the salt's coming from. Contrary here in the United States, in the UK, it tends to be more from processed foods. So that's why we see here a lot more emphasis when we're talking about voluntary programs and such by the government. The emphasis is put on food processing. So strategies, again, will be dependent upon where you are in the planet, and how sodium is actually getting introduced to the consumers. I think the one interesting one I found, though, was the tax. Certain geographies are now starting to look at a sodium tax, sodium-specific tax, or just a general tax. We do it here regionally, so not so much on the salt side. There's been talk about it, but really emphasis a lot we're seeing here is more on the sugar side of it, and there are a few examples of that occurring. So what does it look like when we're talking about the sodium in the reduction in the food supply? We're seeing Brazil, Canada, Ireland, South Africa, and United Kingdom are just three very good or five examples of that. They're voluntary, all except for South Africa. But when you do the analysis of the food products, a lot of them are actually meeting some of the targets, and some of them are not. So again, more emphasis is going to be placed on by the government in order to really try and get people to reduce that sodium content in the food supply chain. So the impact on the population itself. So again, looking at a systematic review, many countries are reporting a sodium reduction anywhere from 5% up to 36%. I think one that stands out is Finland. Finland's used a lot. They've been having a big initiative since the early 90s. And they have seen a 36% reduction in their sodium intake. United Kingdom, they started working as a whole United Kingdom in the South back in the early 2000s to try and get sodium reduction reduced in the population. And again, emphasis put on food manufacturers and trying to do that. They, again, in the starting base was about 9.5 grams. They're reporting lower levels, about 8, 8.6, depending upon which country in the UK you're speaking of. So lastly, just kind of in conclusion, when we think about this, lots of things are going on, lots of activities going on. That sodium, but first and foremost, sodium is essential and nutrient. We definitely need it in our diets in order to maintain health. Randomized control trials really suggest a dose response, so increased sodium, increased blood pressure. But these epidemiological studies are bringing a new discussion to the table. It is about cardiovascular diseases and cardiovascular events as well as mortality. And what does that really mean to the story of sodium? I really believe that the identification of better biomarkers might be something to really consider. With traditionally using blood pressures, but a lot of this work that's coming out, showing the blood lipids as well as the renal hormones and enzymes, et cetera, are really something that might be more suited or tells more about what the story is actually occurring. And then really a lot of these programs that I was talking about where the governments are monitoring it, they're trying to lower sodium as well in the food supply, is to really understand your monitoring programs and really making sure you're getting quality data. A lot of it might be dietary survey, which really isn't the greatest means because it's memory recall. Probably 24-hour urinary excretion is probably one of the better indicators of sodium intake. So the better consistency that you can get, the better the quality of the data is, and the better we're going to understand kind of the sodium debate and really what are the proper numbers that we should be looking at. With that, I thank you, and we'll turn it over to our host.
Thank you, and now it's time for question and answers. So, can I have a mic, please, if you have a handy mic?
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Alderman. Do the international health agencies, what do they think about the evidence that you presented in your presentation?
Good question. A couple of points I think I could make. The European societies of hypertension and cardiovascular disease explored this question a couple of years ago. And they decided that there was insufficient evidence to know whether or not low sodium would reduce cardiovascular events, and they called for randomized trials to be done. A group put together by a former president of the American Heart Association just published a call for randomized trials before we introduce any national or universal guidelines about blood pressure. That's gotten a lot of response, and the difficulty of doing a randomized trial is controlling the sodium diet. Because people eat what they want in a free living society. The idea that they've put forward is that perhaps it could be done in prisons, where food is provided for the institution. So if you had a bunch of prisons, you could modify the sodium in one and another. I mean, it's got lots of problems, but the group that's doing it has made real progress, and there's a very good deal of interest at the NIH and in the prison community. Actually, in prisons in the United States, a great deal of research is done. It's got to be research that's going to be of benefit to mankind. It's not, but this, of course, would be. I think that there's movement in the world, and I think that the simplistic idea, which was not irrational, that you could, by lowering blood pressure, change cardiovascular outcomes. I think there's a more sophisticated approach. And for example, the recognition in Great Britain that was just described there, they looked at that, the effect of modifying the sodium content of processed food. They did it by mandate, about a 25% reduction in sodium intake, sodium content. But as I showed you, the government did surveys every 2 years for a 6-year period and demonstrated there was absolutely no effect on sodium intake. So, I mean, and that's would have been expected from the fact that sodium intake hasn't changed in 50 years, as far as we can tell, anywhere in the world. And it's hard to believe that there isn't some reason for this that's beyond the control of either industry or government. So I think that, the ground is shifting. It'd be interesting to see what happens next.
Do you think as Morton Satir said, the narrative will change against salt? With those?
Yeah, I think it's changing. I mean, for example, the European guidelines, which were the most recently, or their recommendations was most recently released, they no longer accept the notion that universal sodium restriction, and they call for science to do it. It's not enough to say we think it's a good idea. There's got to be some evidence, and it doesn't exist. Yeah. No, and I think that, I don't know, you all might know more than I do about what public opinion is, but I think the press, at least in this country, in the United States, is changing dramatically.
Any idea of the sodium intake, of the percentage of the sodium intake that comes from sodium chloride?
I'm not sure, I do know, but I think that it primarily is sodium chloride. I think most of it, somewhere between 85 and 95%.
Zafar?
I had a quick question also for you, and that is, you showed some trend data. Is there any data, are there data that go back a little bit further? I mean, one question would be, has the diet, for example, in a country like the US, shifted from, a lot of salt coming from table salt to more salt coming from processed foods as those processed foods were more available? Is there longer term data going back, say, to the 50s or so on sodium intake?
Yes, there is. There have been 58 good studies, the first of which was in the United States, done in the 1950s. I've forgotten when, and the last one in 2008. During that time, we saw the transition from not processed food to much more processed food. And after that, we saw this tremendous enthusiasm about lowering sodium intake. Sodium intake, mean sodium intake in all of those studies was surrounded in a narrow range, 3.6 grams a day. It hasn't changed, and it's not different in most of the world. There are exceptions, of course.
This is the second last question because we have already crossed the time. Please.
So, what's the impact of hydration on hypertension, and how does that get built into studies if there is an impact of hydration on hypertension?
Your question is addressed to Dr. Alderman?
The effect of hydration, on the impact of, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good one.
Zafar.
For Janis, you said 3 countries that are thinking to increase or tax for salt, on salt. I hope not France, because they had a revolution of that. What countries? A tax on salt. Okay.
Yeah, so they are, and again, it deals with either the sodium directly or just kind of general taxation on it. Again, it was like Fiji, Hungary, and
Portugal. Okay. Thank you.
Zafar, that gentleman in the back, and then Mort has the last question.
I have a comment for Dr. Johnson. If you're relying on randomized clinical trials to determine effect on cardiovascular disease of whether it's sodium or saturated fat, and those studies don't randomize and they don't determine refined carb intake, then those results are not very valid. When you look at all the studies that have looked at saturated fat, et cetera, and heart disease, and they don't account for refined carb intake, you throw the results out the window.
I most certainly am not qualified to answer medical type experiments, like I said, I'm a food scientist. But I do know that there's a lot of scrutiny that undergoes when publications are being put out. And again, that's why we'll have committees, ad hoc committees that form together to really try and go through to make sure that the best quality scientific evidence is presented in decision makings when it comes to policy formations, et cetera. I don't know, you guys probably have a lot more to say on that than I potentially would. You have comment?
Last question.
Actually, I don't know if this is a question. Well, a couple of comments. One was on hydration. It's always very fascinating for everybody to realize when you go to the hospital, the first thing they do is put you on a saline drip, which on average is 3 liters a day, 0.9% sodium chloride, so you're getting 27 grams of sodium chloride a day, plus whatever they're feeding you. And they're measuring your blood pressure every 4 hours in it. So the relationship between sodium chloride, blood pressure, is a little bit, but one thing we have to say at the same time is rather than eating 27 grams of sodium chloride in a restaurant and not drinking, and then feeling this pressure, you're getting all the hydration along with it at the same time. So your blood, it's got nothing to do with sodium chloride. It's got to do with you getting a balanced amount. The other thing that's very, very interesting is the quotation of WHO that recommends 2 grams of sodium a day. That's very, very interesting because you have to look at details. And the most wonderful thing about this Palace publication, who measured sodium, most recent publication measured sodium across the world. The one thing they did that's different than anybody else is they used the standard UN country format. First time we've ever had the sodium consumptions in the standard UN country format, which allows you to compare that data against all the public health data on the WHO website. It's their own data, also in a UN country format. So you put salt, and then you put blood pressure. and you'll find out that anyone consuming below 2.5 grams of sodium per day, and anybody consuming above 4.5 to 5 grams of sodium per day, they have the highest blood pressure. And the lowest blood pressure is that range in between. But their policy says that you should be consuming below 2 grams of sodium a day. So the policy on their own website and the data on their own website, which anyone in this room can access, are totally in contradiction to one another. So, I mean, there's little tiny details. It's what I said before. We follow this narrative without questioning it. The one time that you just take a few minutes and you actually question the data, you find out that, you know, we've been really led astray. Anyway, I didn't want to go. I'm sorry for taking so much time. Excuse me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.